We're going to go ahead and get started with one of our last breakout sessions of the day. So I'll just turn it right on over to the panel.
Thank you. So are my slides up? Are the slides up there? Or do I have to do something? Oh, oops. Well, good afternoon, all few of you. Hopefully there's a lot more people online. Welcome to the presentation this afternoon entitled Stability-Instability of Low-Income Hispanics, Findings from the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. Before I talk about the specific focus of this afternoon's three related presentations and introduce our speakers, I'd like to first take a moment to share a little on the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. I should note, a little legal disclaimer, that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. All mistakes are mine. So, did I skip too far? This is not my presentation, or is it? Oh, it is. Somebody slipped in an extra slide. I want to talk a little bit about the Hispanic Research Center. It was established by Child Turns and Abt Associates, along with our university partners, New York University, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and the University of Maryland, and it's funded through a 5-year, $5 million cooperative agreement with the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within ACF and HHS. So what do we do in this center? The overarching goal of the Hispanic Research Center is to conduct new research and provide research-based information to inform ACF programs and policies supporting Hispanic children and families around three priority areas: healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, poverty and self-sufficiency, and early care and education. And our work is guided by one important question that we keep coming back to, and that is, what, at the end of the day, should programs and policies be doing differently, if anything, to better serve Hispanic children and families? And because the goal of the center is to help inform programs and policies, our target population is primarily low-income Hispanic families. To further guide our work, the Hispanic Research Center has three objectives. The first is to advance a cutting-edge research agenda across the three priority areas. The second is to build an extensive network of partners, develop a knowledge base, along with new tools and resources, and also to support emerging scholars. The third objective is to implement an innovative communication and dissemination approach. It's critical to our mission that the work of the center actually gets in the hands of the key stakeholders, such as yourselves. So, why do we need a research center on Hispanic children and families? Well, the answer, we believe, lies in four demographic facts. Today, roughly 1 in 4 of all children in the U.S. is Hispanic, which represents the largest and one of the fastest growing population groups in the U.S., and has implications for many of the program evaluations that are being discussed here at the RECS conference. And I know I was talking to a colleague about a question that came up in the bias session this morning about that very fact. Second, economic security is precarious for many Hispanic children. Roughly a third of Latino children live in poverty, which represents a growing share of the target population served by many of the programs that we're talking about. Third, the vast majority of Hispanic children are U.S. born, and recent increases in the Latino population are driven primarily by births, not by immigration. Finally, although the vast majority of Latino children are U.S. born, the immigrant experience is a reality for many of them. For example, roughly half have at least one parent born outside the U.S., and roughly 3/4 speak a language other than English at home. Again, implications for our programmatic responses. As we think about our programs and policies can best support Latino children and families, it's important to consider how their unique family experiences and characteristics, including exposure to languages other than English, growing up in poverty, as well as the considerable diversity that exists within the Latino population, may influence their engagement and participation in many publicly funded programs and services. So that leads us to this afternoon's presentation. Given the changing demographics, many policies and programs are attempting to better serve Hispanic children in need. To realize these efforts, We must better understand the family environments in which low-income Hispanic children live. A key component of the family environment is the degree of stability or instability experienced. Instability can be experienced within several domains related to family life, including household composition, family structure, family routines, childcare, income, employment, etc. In this session, we have 3 complementary or synergistic papers that explore stability versus instability among low-income Hispanic families, focusing on household composition, changes in family structure, and income instability in that order. Across these domains, we find the story to be more characterized by stability than instability, sorry for giving the punchline, for low-income Hispanic families, particularly those with foreign-born parents. Our first speaker, as we kick off, is Kim Turner. She'll be presenting the paper on complex and varied households of low-income Hispanic children. Kim is a research scientist in the reproductive health and family formation research area at Child Trends. As a social demographer, her research focuses on the interplay between socioeconomic status and family formation behaviors, the subsequent effects on racial ethnic disparities, and understanding the role that public policy plays in countering growing inequality. Dr. Turner also examines policies and programs associated with men's family experiences, focusing on child support policies and responsible fatherhood programs. Kim.
Fabulous. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and just get started. This project examines the living arrangements and household composition of low-income Hispanic children and compares their experiences to that of their white and black peers. Let's begin this discussion by talking about the changes in family and also distinguishing between the terms of family and households. Families across industrialized countries are experiencing rapid and important changes. Marriage is in decline, cohabitation, non-marital childbearing is increasing, and these changes have not impacted racial and ethnic groups in the same way. And how these changes have impacted Hispanic families and children is less understood than it is for other groups. What do we mean by families and households? Family, generally speaking, refers to those who are connected by blood marriage or adoption, whereas households refer to those who occupy the same housing unit, who reside in the same housing unit. These two entities often overlap, but not necessarily so. As we've already talked about today, many Hispanic children are poor or near poor, and to better meet the needs of Hispanic children and families, it's critical that we understand the nature of the households in which they live. Both families and households are critically important to adult and child well-being, and they shape the resources and impact program eligibility. And understanding the interplay between Hispanic families and households may offer critical knowledge to stakeholders on how to better reach and support Hispanic children and families. Family structure, when we talk about family structure, we often focus on the relationship between the parents in the household. We often overlook the presence of other adults in the household. And these folks can often serve many important roles. There could be an additional worker, someone who can provide childcare, or there can also be an adult dependent. In thinking about complex households, these can signal both needs as well as signal strength. This project provides descriptive information on the living arrangements and household composition of low-income Hispanic children and compares their experiences to that of their black and white peers. We use data from the 2012 American Community Survey, a nationally representative survey of households in the U.S. The analytic sample is comprised of Hispanic, white, and black children and households in the bottom income quartile, which is approximately $23,000 in 2012 dollars. Estimates are presented for a range of household measures, and the differences are estimated by parental nativity as well as racial and ethnic groups differences are tested. And here are some of our key findings. Low-income Hispanic children, shown in orange and purple, reside in larger households than their white and black peers, respectively in the turquoise and yellow. Hispanic children live in households with both more children as well as households with more adults than their white and black counterparts. It is also important to note that Hispanic fertility rates, especially those among the foreign-born, are higher than that of their white and black peers. This contributes both to Hispanic population growth as well as to the young age structure of this population. Results for two-parent married households are in the dark tones in this figure, and results for single-parent households are in the muted tones. So for married households, more than a third of low-income Hispanic children with a foreign-born parent live in households, married two-parent households. This is higher than that of their U.S.-born counterparts, and who look much more similar to that of black children. Nearly twice as many low-income Hispanic children with a U.S.-born parent live in a single-parent household than those with a foreign-born parent. When we consider the presence of fathers in the household, again, we see divergence in the experience of low-income Hispanic families by parents' nativity status. We find that half of low-income Hispanic children with a foreign-born parent live with their biological fathers, see the orange bar here, and this is much higher than their counterparts with U.S.-born parents, as well as higher than that of their low-income white and black peers. Also on the positive side, we find that the majority of low-income Hispanic children live with an employed adult. The vast majority of low-income Hispanic children with a foreign-born parent, over 80%, live with an employed adult, as do about 2/3 of those with U.S.-born parents. This is similar to that of whites, but higher than that of their black peers. Again, this is good news, as adult employment is associated with greater economic resources and stability for children. Looking at the crowdedness of households, we see in this figure that low-income Hispanic children, particularly those with a foreign-born parent, live in crowded conditions. Crowded housing is defined as having 3 or more persons per bedroom. Low-income Hispanic children with a foreign-born parent are roughly twice as likely to live in crowded housing as their counterparts of U.S.-born parents, and roughly 4 times as likely as their white and black peers to live under crowded conditions. When we take this all together, we find that Hispanic child households have characteristics that may offer some advantages as well as some disadvantages. It is important to reiterate the high incidence of adult employment in Hispanic children's households. High levels of employment can offer advantages. Beyond the economic resources, employment represents social integration, routine, role modeling. However, the benefits of employment may actually have some costs, be it parent-child interaction, be it the time spent with children, be it partnered relationships. There's also an important caveat to consider here as well. It's that though there may be employment, that the type of employment also does matter, and there is likely in high incidence that those who are employed, many of whom do not have the best working conditions, and again, that influences their availability and the time they have to spend in their familial relationships. Among Hispanic, it is also, again, important to talk about the divergence by parental nativity status. Among Hispanic children with foreign-born parents, we see greater levels of marriage in two-parent households, married in two-parent households. We see resident fathers, and again, adult employment, higher levels of adult employment relative to their peers. But we also, again, see this high incidence of crowded housing, which may signal need, but may also offer some advantages. Among those with U.S.-born parents, the level of single-parentness as well as non-resident fatherhood households are approaching levels of that of their black peers. And again, the employment among adults is again relatively high. Acknowledging the diversity of low-income Hispanic children's households experiences is important for program outreach. Designing programs to build on the strengths of Hispanic households, especially among the foreign-born, is something to consider and to think about. Again, there's more married two-parent households, fathers are present, a high level of employment. And it is also to think about, in thinking about programs, to think about these unique challenges. And again, this idea of crowded housing. It is potentially an advantage, it's potentially a disadvantage. However, definitely has implications for eligibility for program participation. And so as we kind of think about these characteristics, we also need to think about, are these kind of serving as benefits, or are these in some ways negatively impacting outcomes. And again, another key point to reiterate is the divergence by parental nativity status. Across the ranging indicators that we showed today, we did see this kind of distinct experience among low-income Hispanic children with foreign-born parents compared to the U.S.-born peers, and again, depending on the dimension, different groups were advantaged. So we need to kind of approach how we kind of assess and connect and provide resources to low-income Hispanic children and take into context the complexity in which the households that they live in, as well as the diversity that they experience. So with that, I think I will turn things over to Liz.
Thank you, Kim. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Carberg, who'll be talking on the stability of Latino families in the U.S. Elizabeth is a research scientist in the reproductive health and family formation research area at Child Trends. She's studied parenting with a particular focus on fathers, early childhood development, and the family, social, and cultural factors that impact parents and children. She has a specific interest in how family formation patterns influence fathering and children's social development. Finally, she has also worked with immigrant Latino parents here in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area to explore what cultural and parenting factors Latino immigrants implement to help their children's social, linguistic, and regulatory development.
Good afternoon. After Kim's great snapshot of Latino children's households, I'm going to talk to you today about a project that examines changes in living arrangements and household composition of low-income Hispanic mothers living with their young children, and this change over the early childhood period. I will also be comparing their experiences to that of their white and black counterparts. There, the introduction. So why is it important to understand the living arrangements of instability that children experience? First and foremost, as Kim alluded to, the American family has changed a lot. And this has consequences for children's developmental environments. When change happens, the changes that she was talking about in her introduction of increases in non-marital childbearing, less universal marriage, increases in divorce, these can be particularly concerning and have long-lasting consequences across developmental domains when children experience these early. One thing that's unclear from the literature is whether these patterns of family formation and change differ by race and ethnicity. In particular, Latinos are the largest ethnic minority group in the U.S. and the fastest growing. Latino children, as Mike alluded to, also make up a large proportion of our school-aged children, but we still don't have this fundamental understanding of their home life and changes to it. Given this demographic imperative to understand children's family stability generally and among Latinos specifically, in this study, we examined patterns of family formation and stability among low-income Hispanic families. We look at how patterns of family instability among Latina mothers, both foreign-born and U.S.-born, over the early childhood years compare to that of their white and black counterparts, and how family context might change this association. Here's a graphic representation of those goals. So our research questions address these two main goals. The first being, do race, ethnicity, and nativity status predict mother's stability or instability over this critical period of early childhood? And second, do psychosocial and demographic risk and parenting change this association? So we're going to look at mother's psychosocial and demographic risk and father's parenting. We use the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing data, and our analytic sample consists of a little over 4,500 mothers who self-identified as Latino, either born outside of the U.S. or inside, and this is roughly split 50-50, and white or black mothers who were all U.S. born because very few were born outside of the U.S. So our unit of analysis is mothers who live with their children. Our dependent variable is family instability, which we defined as a change in mother's family structure between when their child was born and when their child was 5 years old. Mothers reported on their relationship status at their child's birth, and then again when their child was 1, 3, and 5 years old. And we use these reports to calculate whether or not they experienced a change in residential romantic relationships over this period. So the first two codes listed here represent stability, either stability in a residential relationship or stability in a non-residential relationship. And the second two represent instability. So the first is just one breakup in this early childhood period, and the second is 2 or more breakups in over the 5 years. To answer the second research question, we looked at several moderating variables, including demographic risk, including income and education, psychosocial risk, including economic stress, parenting stress, and depressive symptoms, and father involvement, which was a composite of father's reports of his frequency of involvement in developmentally appropriate play and reading literacy activities. We also controlled for mother's age at first birth, the number of children in the household, and at the child's birth, her marital intentions to the child's father. So looking at some results, first to address our first research question about whether race, ethnicity, and nativity status are associated with instability, I'm going to first present some descriptive results. So walking through this table, you see that about 75% of foreign-born Latina mothers and 80% of white mothers have a residential birth from this sample, which is pretty comparable. They also, this table also shows that their stability over the early childhood period is equal. So looking at both resident and non-resident mothers who are reporting stability, nearly 70% of both foreign-born Latina mothers and white mothers have stable romantic relationships. When we look at US-born Latina mothers, their rates of stability look a little bit more like their Black counterparts. So first, they have lower rates of, or lower incidence of a residential birth and much lower incidence of a marital birth. And then over the early childhood period, less than 40% are in a residential romantic relationship, which looks a little bit more similar to their Black peers with 23%. We ran regressions to determine whether ethnicity and nativity status predicted stability over this early childhood period, and found that foreign-born Latina mothers were more likely to remain together than their US-born Latina and Black counterparts, and they were less likely to repartner when they broke up, so that 2 or more code of instability, than white, Black, and US-born Latina mothers. So moving on to our second question, are there things going on in the family that changes this association? I'm gonna also present some descriptive statistics first. We've heard from Mike in the introduction, and Kim alluded to this too, that Latino families are more likely to live in poverty, and that's true of this sample too, so I'm not presenting those results, but the foreign-born Latina mothers have the lowest education of all the groups of mothers and the lowest reported household income, which we will look at later in the moderation analyses. But I want to focus on their psychosocial risk and father involvement. So here the red line shows that 7% of foreign-born Latina mothers report depressive symptoms consistent with clinical depression, which is statistically less than their US-born Latina, white, and Black counterparts. They are also reporting comparable levels of parenting stress. So for both foreign-born and US-born Latina mothers, their parenting stress is no different from their Black and white peers. Economic stress is also fairly consistent across the groups. And I will note that this might not be the best measure for our group because this indicates that mothers are reporting on average one economic stressor out of 12, but the economic stressors are fairly intense, things like eviction or not being able to eat because you have no money. So although this is a low-income and at-risk group, it's not as severe as to be showing a lot of variability on this measure. For father involvement, the children with an immigrant Latina mother have comparable frequency of involvement with their fathers as their US-born and Black counterparts, although it is statistically significant, is less at a statistically significant level than their white counterparts. I will say, too, that these means are unadjusted, so anyone who has questions about that can ask me after. So moving on to the moderations, I'm only going to show the statistically significant results here. Again, we did look at depression, parenting stress, economic stress, education, and income. So the first significant moderation was that education changed how likely mothers were to break up. Foreign-born Latina mothers with more education were more likely to break up, whereas white, Black, and US-born Latina mothers with more education were less likely to break up. I have some thoughts about this, but I'm going to make you wait till the end. We also found that mental health changed how likely mothers were to break up. So this figure shows that foreign-born Latina mothers who were not depressed were more likely to break up than their counterparts who were depressed. But for white mothers, their likelihood of breaking up did not depend on their mental health. And foreign-born Latina mother, this interaction was not different compared to US-born Latina mothers or Black mothers. It was just significant between the foreign-born Latina mothers and their white counterparts. So this project showed that family instability among low-income Latina mothers was relatively low compared to their white and Black counterparts, especially considering their higher demographic risk than their white counterparts. And in the first 5 years of life, Latina mothers were more likely to live in stable residential relationships. They were more likely, or they were likely to experience fewer transitions and less likely to experience any transition at all. So looking at the 1 versus 2, they were less likely to experience 2 and less likely to experience 1. But echoing what you've heard already today, nativity status really matters. So when we look at group differences in these trends, it looks like the immigrant Latina mothers are far more stable than their US-born Latina counterparts. We also found that the context of instability, so what's going on in the family that might shape mother's risk for instability, so to speak, mattered in this study. So Latino immigrant parents tend to stay together despite psychosocial and demographic risk. So those with low education and those with depression are not more likely to break up. And there are a couple of things that might be explaining that. First is acculturation. So there's this idea that as immigrant mothers obtain more education, they become more acculturated, and they kind of lose the emphasis on traditional family values that keep families together. Another probably more likely explanation is that mothers who function better can get themselves out of a bad situation. So it's not that happy mothers are breaking up, it's that when they're unhappy and they're not depressed and they have the education to figure out how to get out of a situation, they can get out. And again, the incidence of breaking up is pretty low, so it's not like we're talking about a huge amount of potentially unhappy families that need to break up. So the policy implications, these really echo what Kim was saying, that outreach needs to tailor their efforts by nativity status, which research shows time and again, but there seems to be more of an emphasis on services for immigrant Latino families. So this means that there are implications for which Latino families are most in need of family services, depending on their nativity. as well as which Latino fathers are most likely to live with their kids. I think that this study also shows that there are significant strengths that immigrant Latino mothers offer to their children, and that we need to recognize and support those strengths. So they're more likely to live in, to be in stable relationships over time, which is important. And there's a low prevalence of mental health issues among these mothers. But we also need to recognize their potential challenges. So kind of in the background of all these talks is that they're more likely to live in poverty. And the mothers in this study, very few had a high school degree or higher. They have low education, low incomes, and there was relatively low father involvement, especially compared to their white peers who have comparable rates of father residence. And one reason for that, echoing Kim's point again, is that there might be something going on with the hours that they're working or the shifts that they're working, given their economic need and their low education. So this is a place for policy and future research. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I think both presentations were great in that they talk a lot about the richness and the heterogeneity of the Hispanic population. We're going to shift gears a little bit for the last presentation to look at income instability in Hispanic children. Our next speaker, Lisa Janetian, is a research professor at New York University, senior researcher at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and co-investigator for the Hispanic Center. As an applied economist, her portfolio spans poverty and policy research, including income security, early care and education, and children's development, just about everything. Her current research focuses on the influence of unstable income on family and child well-being, the economic circumstances of Hispanic children, and the ways in which insights from behavioral economics can improve the design of social policies and early childhood interventions. Lisa.
All right. So as Michael introduced, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to think about, it was really nice to start actually with the intricacies of households and families and understanding that context a little bit more. Now I'm going to abstract from that a bit and think about the household as an economic unit and about the individuals in the household as economic agents and tell you a little bit more about what's happening with income in Hispanic children. There's a couple of other ways that this talk's going to deviate. The second, which is probably a good conversation point for after this session, is there is not a theme of distinctions occurring very clearly by nativity status in this work, which continues to be a bit of a puzzle amongst our broader team. And then the third thing is I don't like stock photos. There's no photos in my presentation. So I'm going to give you sort of an economic, my interest, and I think collective interest in this group was, when I looked back at the literature and asked what are the gaping holes in what we don't understand about Hispanic children and their economic lives, it was a sort of refreshing change because the answer was there ain't much out there, so that's great. We've got a lot of gaps to fill. So this portrait is going to have a hyper-focus on income stability, but also give you a glance into kind of the income heterogeneity of Hispanic families in this country. We can do this with large national data sets. I do this in this talk with the Survey of Income and Program Participation over 2 time periods. I'll tell you a little bit more about those data. These are inherently descriptive analyses, no fancy econometrics, no fancy quasi-experimental designs, but lots of interesting differences over time across income group, across racial ethnic identity, and mostly focusing on economic outcomes. There's nothing, false advertising, no children's outcomes. I want to do a little shameless promotion. Actually, I encourage you all to get to the National Center's website. There is production of terrific, very accessible materials. I'm lucky that there's been a lot produced, written on this topic. I encourage you to look at it. There's also a great blog series on the topic, and we're looking for more writers if you'd like to contribute to the topic. We welcome your input. A podcast, and there's also a data training that accompanies this topic. So just very simply, in the way I'm thinking about the world, there are important household economic circumstances to understand. that both consider overall level of resources as well as the stability of those resources. These will affect family life, time with children, parenting, routines, and these will have some effects on children's outcomes. And the interest here is to look at these relationships by Hispanic ethnicity, and we have over a decade of data in which we can do this with large national data sets. This is sort of the grand picture of the research agenda. Why the economic lives of Hispanic children? Mike gave a very good overview of why Hispanic children in general should be a topic of interest. I'm going to hone in a little bit on the fact that early human capital formation is affected by household economic resources. We have decades of research to suggest this. Hispanic children are differentially economically resource constrained, but they will comprise most of our future workforce. And outside of static depictions of poverty that we know well, that have been generated by the census, we understand actually very little about who is economically contributing to these families of Hispanic children, what are the economic states under different macro environments, what are the dynamics, and what are the sources of income. So because of the large Hispanic population growth, we also have this nice situation. We can actually do a lot through these large national studies because we have big enough samples now to learn about them. So one contention is discussions of poverty must consider Hispanic children. It's sort of unavoidable. Why income instability? This focus on income instability actually precedes my work with the Hispanic Research Center. It started many years ago. Kind of moving from this and acknowledging that our work on poverty does not recognize a lot of the dynamics that in part became reality through the recession. And through that work, we found that differences in income instability between rich and poor families increased 5-fold since 1984, mirroring trends in income level inequality. Employment is as precarious as social assistance, and these are the two main sources of income for low-income families. And so some of the other attributes we bring to this work is looking at this from the lens of a child. The economics literature has long looked at the issues of instability, but largely from the perspective of earnings and adults who are employed. And I wanted to also just mention that this work complements a lot of the other very good microanalysis and qualitative research that's happening right now to understand income dynamics. I want to point out especially the financial diaries work that's happening with some colleagues at NYU. Okay, so let's motivate this from a policy perspective. I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to whiz through this. If we imagine these various scenarios, so most of the data and most of what we understood about income comes from these reports of usually calendar or some kind of last year annual measure of income. So what do we miss when we're only use that as our metric for capturing families? We miss all of this. Then in fact, there's a lot of dips and flows that happen with income. And the colors didn't come out so well, but let's say this is a representative family of 3 eligible for SNAP. Depending on where you are in your cycle of receiving income, affects your eligibility for programs. So all the families at these various month points that are in the gray area would not be eligible for SNAP if that happened to be a point, let's say, for recertification. So there are important, and SNAP is an example of a program that does determine eligibility within a year time point, right? It's not an annual determination. So this does, what happens to income and where you're at in your income cycle can very much affect your eligibility for programs, services. I'm going to skip this. The Survey of Income and Program Participation is hosted by the U.S. Census Bureau. It actually started in 1984. One benefit, it's very difficult to find the frequency of income information to do this kind of work. There's only 2, maybe I'll say just 1 data set where you can do it really well. This is it. It has monthly income available, and we use the first 9 waves within a panel, which covers about 2.5 years of a calendar year. It's detailed by source, and not great, but there's some selective information on family and children's outcomes, so you can actually get bigger pictures about the family. The other feature about this, it's a large nationally representative sample, and you have data across the income spectrum. There's no way I only have 5 minutes. Really? Oh my gosh. Okay, let's skip through this. Okay, so we're measuring income and income instability. It's real income, includes cash assistance, but excludes other forms of post-transfer income. I'm looking at quintiles of families and using various measures of income stability that tap into frequency, that tap into overall magnitude, as well as direction. And there's some trade-offs with these statistics and how easy they are to translate and their statistical properties. Okay. So here, to give you a picture, this is using the 2004 SIP, so this is over the 2004-06 period, and you can see sort of a confirmation here that Hispanic children are much more likely to be in the lower income quintiles, equally likely to be in the third quintile, and then you see the balance of non-Hispanic children that are above sort of 20%, so you'd expect equal distribution if we were in a perfectly equal society, but you see that Hispanic children are tipped towards low income. What we see in income instability is that instability is higher as anticipated amongst low-income families than high-income families. So the bars on the left have a much higher value. This is the coefficient of variation than the bars on the right. But Hispanic low-income households are more income stable than other low-income households. So this is the light orange color. The 0.51 there indicates that even though all low-income households are much more income unstable, Hispanic low-income households actually bring some stability with them that non-Hispanic children don't. You can look at this through another way, a measure of income shocks. And you can see here that the children in Hispanic, low-income children in Hispanic households are less likely to, are experiencing fewer negative income shocks. Okay, and so that's one of the sort of features of the stability. Okay, let me show you quickly. So these next two slides do a little bit of unpacking, looking separately at the non-Hispanic group by racial ethnic identity, and also specifically looking at the influence of social assistance. So social assistance programs offer their benefits on a monthly basis. You can think of it as an income stabilizing source of income. It's predictable over the certified period in which you receive it. And you see here that when we add the cash value of food stamp benefits, that we see a stabilizing effect, most especially for Black families. That's the third cluster of bars. So you can see the measure of instability in dark orange compared to the measure of instability with the value of food stamps in the funny peach color, and a big gap, so a drop in instability for non-Hispanic Black family, children who are non-Hispanic Black households, and you see barely a change on the far left for children in Hispanic households. And that is primarily because children in Hispanic households aren't receiving social assistance, so they're not receiving this additional form of predictable income. There's an upside to that too. It means they're also not relying on social assistance, right? And so that's what this slide is showing you. What is the stability coming from? And it's coming from earnings. So there's higher earned income stability among Hispanic child households. Not as high as children who are in low-income white households, but much higher than children in non-Hispanic Black households and non-Hispanic other households. So that gives you a picture of income stability prior to the recession, what happened post. There are similar proportions of Hispanic children in the lowest income groups across these two time periods, pre and during and post-recession. But you did see a slight shift of children in Hispanic households. There were fewer of them in higher income groups. So there was a movement of Hispanic children from higher income to middle income. This gives you a picture of their monthly earnings. And here you see that did not shift very much over these two time periods. Again, the one place where you saw a shift was a change in income of the highest income Hispanic children. I mentioned the measure of income shocks. And so the other dramatic shift in these two time periods in terms of giving an economic picture of what's happening to Hispanic children is in the later period, they were less likely to experience positive income shocks. This could be a sobering story if positive income shocks are indeed a sign to economic mobility. And so what's happening in the post-recession period, what might be happening is a movement of Hispanic children from higher income to middle income, fewer experiences of positive income shocks, which might be a signal of lower economic mobility. So Hispanic children are no more likely to experience low and unstable income over these two periods. There's a question about whether this might be because of compositional differences. So these are not the same children that we're following over time, right? These are draws of different cohorts over two time periods. But across these demographic indicators, they actually look quite similar in terms of number of adults, education, marital status, employment status of parent. But there are these other aspects of economic life that did appear to change over this period. A shift of Hispanic households to lower ends of the income distribution. Fewer positive income shocks might be a signal of less upward trajectory. And this raises all kinds of interesting questions about whether income stability is a byproduct of stable under or unemployment, and what's happening in general with household employment over these two periods. I want to quickly mention that I said this at the beginning. I'm going to come back to this because I think it's an interesting puzzle for us. One thing that we can do with the SIP is we can also look at nativity status, we can actually look at citizenship, we can look at country of origin, we can look at geographic region, we can also look at linguistic isolation. The only characteristic that captures some heterogeneity within Hispanic households that mattered in terms of income stability was actually language. So we didn't see the differences by nativity status on this domain, like you saw in the household and family structure domain. But we did see some interesting differences by comfort with the English language and English language isolation of the family. So how many adults in the household can actually speak English? I think I was sort of trained as a labor economist, and this raises sort of very interesting questions about discrimination in the labor market, navigating services, and social and economic integration that are very language-based. So another dimension to think about that might be superseding nativity status in this domain. Okay, I'm at a roundup, so that's good. It's really important to think about economic resources during childhood in general. We know that from a lot of existing literature. We're at an interesting time point demographically in this country where more and more of our population of income-poor children are being drawn from a particular racial ethnic group. We have to start paying attention to some of the special characteristics of that group. But that group, as a recurring theme that we've all mentioned, brings some assets to the table that doesn't seem comparable to children of other racial ethnic groups. They're more likely to be poor, but also have stable income. So there might be an opportunity here to really capitalize on their strengths. Kim mentioned that there's more employment in Hispanic households. We see this in the SIP data. That's pretty consistent over this entire time period. These children are much more likely to be living in a household with at least one employed adult. The future research in this area will focus on some of the time use, earnings, and jobs over this decade, and try to understand how these characteristics of employment and income are interacting with the policy arena and the policy landscape changes. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So we're going to finish off with some brief remarks by Gina Adams before we open it up for some questions and discussion. Gina is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. She's a national expert on factors that shape the affordability, quality, and supply of childcare and early education services, and the ability of low-income families to benefit from them. Since the mid-1980s, that's a long time, she's worked on a range of childcare and early education programs, including childcare subsidies, Head Start, Early Head Start, state pre-K, two-generation models, and quality initiatives. Her current work includes a focus on exploring factors that affect whether children of immigrants participate in state pre-kindergarten programs, examining absenteeism in early childhood programs, and assessing two-generational models. Gina.
And I'm actually going to be talking about stability and instability instead of any of those things.
So I decided that I was really going to focus my energy really around this stability question, because I think that that's a place that I've been working a lot on recently, and I think there's some interesting angles to bring into this conversation. Stability is, you've heard about it, it's an incredibly interesting, very complex issue that I think we're just starting to unpack. We did a conference, Lisa was there several years ago, there's conference proceedings on our website, just look up Gina Adams and Stability at urban.org, and you can find it's kind of a nice overview of some of these issues. It's getting a lot of traction these days, I think. People are increasingly thinking about this, and I think we're getting to be more sophisticated and nuanced about how we think about these issues. I think you saw some of that today. I really appreciate the different angles these papers took. The heterogeneity of the immigrant population, the Latino population, really unpacking some of the differences within them. I'm not surprised you all looked at that. You're the experts at that. But I think it's an absolutely essential piece to keep on bringing to the table. That's way too simple to think that the immigrant or Latino experience is a homogeneous one. I really like the way these papers really thought about some of these different issues around stability. And I thought it was lovely to see what felt like some good news on some issues. But I'm going to add some caveats to that, because one of the issues about instability is that there's not a common definition of what instability means or whether it's good or bad. And so I think thinking about our language and trying to unpack some of those issues is going to be useful. Stability is not always good, right? I mean, being stuck in an abusive relationship, not a good thing. Being stuck in a violent neighborhood, not a good thing. So I think we have this tendency to think of instability as bad and stability as good, but it's more complex than that. Instability in low doses, if it's managed well, is great. Adversity, mobility involves instability on some level. So thinking about this terminology is going to be important. What do we know about what makes instability bad? Well, it seems to be a lot of different things, unfortunately, that we don't do a very good job of measuring. Is it intentional? Is it predictable? Is it something that the person wanted to do? That can be less stressful than the opposite. Is it desirable? Is it in a positive direction or a negative direction? Is it one-time shock? Is it chronic, ongoing kinds of ups and downs that you saw in Lisa's data? How big is it? Is it a big change? Is it a little change? Is it one change, or is it the beginning of a chain of dominoes that are knocking things down, that you got divorced and then you lost your job and then you got evicted and then, or is it just one big bad thing that you can recover from? What kind of support systems do you have to support you? The timing in children's development, is it during their infancy, early childhood? We're now seeing potentially another interesting time during adolescence that it might be having some particular impacts. And then one of the things I think is particularly interesting for this population, the growing recognition that I've been thinking a lot about of the fear of instability can be as damaging. So if you live in a community where everybody around you has parents who are being deported, you may not experience that, but that's going to be bad. If you live in a violent community, your parent may not get shot, but somebody else's did. So the collective kind of insecurity side of instability and the stress that that creates for kids and families and the parenting abilities is important. I do want to just stress, I think it's assumed, but just to be clear for this audience, the big mechanism here, there's multiple mechanisms by which instability affects people, but stress is one of them. Stress for the kid, stress for the parent, can you be a good parent, resources, there's a whole list of things, but stress is a big piece of it. Unfortunately, the data we have don't really allow us to look at those characteristics that I just laid out. We may show one event, but we don't know that if it's one event or whether it's a set of previous events that caused it. Often we assume that something bad happens to that child after that event, that it's due to that event. Or it may be due to their new state, but it may actually be that there's a set of things happen, or maybe the psychological stress of the transition that's causing that outcome. So thinking through what it is that's causing the outcomes we care about. Our data may not prove stability. Just because somebody's employed from one place to another, we heard about this, doesn't mean that they're actually in a stable job. Maybe multiple jobs, maybe they're managing 2 or 3 at the same time, it may be that their schedules change every week. So what we think of in our data as a stable situation may actually not be. Or as Lisa talked about, the amount of change that can happen within month to month to month to month, whereas a lot of our data sets show 1 year to the next year to the next. A lot of missing information. I think we're now, for example, there's some great work being done, Julia Henley and others, Lisa, you may be involved with this, kind of the job precarity work. Like we now finally are getting some data that allow us to look at things like unstable work. We didn't used to have that. We need more of that kind of effort across the board. We have indicators that are really ambiguous, like crowded housing is a fascinating one. Could be great. You have lots of adults around. It's your grandmother, your uncle, your cousins. Or it could be that people are coming and going all the time.
It could be that it's your mother's boyfriend this week, it's somebody else next week, very unstable. We don't know. The timing issues are important. So I think we need better data to start thinking about what instability, if we think of instability as being a bad thing, we need to be having the data to prove that the instability we're looking at is actually some of these issues. And I think we need to be very cautious and thoughtful, which I think all of our panelists were, about interpreting the findings that we see, because we don't know whether or not they're good or bad sometimes. And finally, a few things that just made me, these presentations made me think about in terms of the Latino experience. I think there's some really interesting questions related to the acculturation issues about kind of cultural norms and understanding about things like stress and deprivation. I have family in Guatemala. I think about a rural Guatemalan woman ending up in Washington, D.C., and what her expectations would be about what would be stressful, what would be normal, what would be food deprivation. I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to those questions, but thinking about how some of these issues may play out differently in terms of the questions we ask and how we measure them. The low language proficiency thing, I think, is huge. I think we don't know, I mean, we're looking at it, but I think how that plays into this, the implications that has for social networks, those things buffer people from stress. That's how you get through stressful times, is you have social networks around you that help. The role of trauma prior to coming to this country, huge. I think something that we need to be thinking a lot about. You know, you may ask questions about being depressed. It may not translate quite the same way for somebody who's gone through, gang violence in Salvador before they came. And then whether or not I think our measures mean the same thing in terms of the consequences for folks who may have different experiences. So I'm going to end it there and open it up for other questions.
Is this on? Yeah, I guess it is. The green light's on. So we'll open it up for questions. I'm going to stay seated for this part. Any questions? A quiet group, a subdued group. Oh, there's a hand way back there. I can't see. You can use one of the microphones wherever they are, and I'd love to, if you introduce yourself too.
Sure. So I'm Carolyn Heinrich from Vanderbilt University. Just curious, because I know we just talked about the SIP as being one of the few existing data sets for studying income instability on this population, but also the point was made earlier that because Hispanics are now a larger proportion of our population, we should now be able to study them in a wider set of our national data sets. I know for some of us who have looked into it, depending on what your subgroup of interest is, and so it seems we're still lacking some details we'd like to have, for example, about their status. And in particular, the point was also made in one of the earlier presentations that their households can be more complex. You can have other adults in there, and we also know that the status of those adults can vary. And so getting around in a long roundabout way to my question is do you see, do we have new promising data sets coming out or new fields in ongoing data collections that might help us to get at this better? Because I think my experience is, and there's some really good small scale studies that have been done that overcome some of those limitations, but find a lot of frustration in the currently available data. Will those frustrations be overcome? Is there promise or hope for us that there are better data coming or existing? Or maybe there's something now we're newly coming available you could point us to. I'd love to know about it.
So I think part of your question is a little bit confounded with domain, right? Because I needed a data set with frequent income measurement and then kind of backed into, okay, what else can I do here in terms of measuring aspects of the heterogeneity of Hispanic households, right? But I want to turn the mic over either to Lena or Mike so they can talk about some of the work of the center is to create these resources, information resources about what data can be used to answer different questions. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the hope is to make us smarter at the points where we are designing studies to include different types of measures. So you want to
thanks. And that's an excellent question and one that we've struggled with because with all these large data sets, depending, as Lisa said, depending upon what your question of interest is, some may be better suited for others. One of the efforts that we did as part of the center, and Lizzie Wildsmith's here, who played a key role in that, was to look across 34 data sets and look at the variables that were included in these major data sets, whether it's SIP and LSY, ECLSB, all the major data sets that people often use for doing data analyses. And we used some work that had been done by the Hispanic work group that was of the predecessor to the center that ACF had funded, a Hispanic work group, to identify from the literature 10 variables that are key for variables that are useful for understanding the heterogeneity of the Hispanic population. And so in the briefs that we've done, we look at those different variables and how they're reflected in the different data sets. And in fact, the table straight across, well, down the hall and straight across, at the bottom of the stairs, there's we have a table and there's a computer set up, thanks to Lena, which has an interactive tool so that if you're planning to do a study and you want to look at a specific data set or you're interested in a specific set of questions, you can go to the interactive tool, you can go to the briefs, you can go to the interactive tool, and you can look at which data sets have the different combinations of the 10 different variables on Hispanic heterogeneity. We also have one on early care and education and the Hispanic heterogeneity variables. So, but those are very important questions because as Lisa alluded to, we're trying to help the field as a whole better understand how the kinds of questions, the kinds of issues that you need to understand around that variability of the population so that when you're thinking about a particular question of interest, that you then go into it with your eyes wide open, knowing that some data sets are better than others in terms of capturing that variability. But that's an important part, just almost as much as the specific question that you want to ask. So in Lisa's case, it was income instability, which she was kind of limited to SIP because of what was there. But that it's a helpful resource. Yeah, it's on our website, and you can also access it. I think we have some of the copies of the briefs out there, and you can look at www.hispanicresearch.org.
Hi, this is Hans Bos at the American Institute for Research. I think I thought it was fascinating work and really important work, and also, as the discussant said, quite hopeful. The one thing that worried me a little bit, and that you may be able to comment on a little bit, is this whole nativity, the nativity split, basically, where you see Hispanics who were born here actually doing worse in a lot of the dimensions that you were showing than Hispanics who arrive here, and that's not how it's supposed to work. And so I'm just wondering if there is a way or maybe you've done this through basically controlling for different factors and to see whether you can make that nativity effect go away. I mean, I think one factor is, the selection factor of being an immigrant. I mean, that tends to be associated with positive things, like taking the trouble of actually crossing a border. The other thing is there's lots of regional differences, and so Hispanic people in certain parts of the country are much more likely to be native born than in other parts of the country. Country where they're coming from, people from certain countries are much more likely to have been born in the United States than people from other countries. And I was just wondering, did you all try to control for those things, or is this just so purely descriptive at this point? And then if it is, I would say be careful with it, because it might actually send a message that, well, maybe this is not such a great place for people to immigrate into, or this is not such a potentially successful and stable group of people.
Thank you for that. So in the Fragile Families data set, the options for country of origin are pretty limited, as are options for determining geographic location and other things. The focus is really on what's going on in the family, so there's like a lot of in-depth questions asked of the parents on that and assessments of the child. So in our study, we did control for a lot of factors that we could think of. This was kind of like a snapshot in pieces of the larger project, but trying to think of as many economic factors that could be associated with this immigrant paradox that you're alluding to, family functioning, co-parenting, indicators of kind of general well-being, the moderators that we showed, where education and mental health were kind of changing the association between race, ethnicity, and instability, included the stressors as controls, as well as income, age at first birth, their hopes for marriage, and various other psychological characteristics. So we are doing our best to unpack this, but I think that you're pointing to a key hole in the research that we have yet to fill, that people talk about this immigrant paradox and we don't totally understand it. And also there is a lot of great qualitative work about how different Latino families can be depending on what country they're from, but there aren't large enough numbers from each of the countries to really look at them in larger data sets. So I think that your point is well taken. I don't think that this points to kind of like a bad immigrant experience necessarily, or like that native-born Americans are doomed. I think that we just need better data and more research on this. Do you want to?
You can only say they're doomed if you believe their economic circumstances don't matter, right? I just want to, right, I'm not seeing the distinction on nativity status in the way that's being seen in these other data sets. I'm not making claims to whether that's right or wrong, but it's not a consistent pattern across the domains, so just a reminder.
And just to add to that, I think that your point is you raised some good points, and it's one of the issues that we've struggled with across a number of different areas, not just this acculturation paradox, but the linking or the need to link some of the quantitative analyses that we're doing with some qualitative analyses to get under the hood. So we can have a whole similar discussion around, early care and education, decision-making and preferences that have some of the same issues around what's driving it. I think it's opened up for us this need to really strike that balance between both this qualitative and quantitative work, probably more so than in many other areas because of these issues. We're in uncharted territories in many cases, and we're really trying to create a field. I think one of you had mentioned that, in that there's not a whole lot of work that's out there. At least it was your comment, that it's kind of like the Wild West in some respects, in that there's a lot of gaps and a lot of work that needs to be done. So thanks for bringing that up. Other questions? Jay, you look like you're... See, I knew you were ready to ask a question.
So, actually, Liz, this is a question for you. It just occurred to me, I was thinking about the education effect that actually increases the likelihood of instability, right? In a number of changes in family structure, and that is very different. I mean, when you think about, like the divorce literature, college-educated individuals are showing considerable decline in divorce rates right now. At least that's my understanding. And I was just wondering if it might be interesting to look at not just education as a continuous variable, but to see if there's, what happens if you just look at college-educated people.
I think that is.
It may be I don't know how large that sample is, but it might be worth sort of dichotomizing that variable instead of just looking at it as a continuous variable. So, just a thought.
Yeah, I should say Jay contributed to this paper. So I think
So you can't ask the question then.
No, it was a great suggestion.
You should answer it, that's right.
We did dummy code it, so given the distribution of education on the foreign-born Hispanic mothers, it might have been less than high school education versus all else, and I can look at that and see. I know that there were not many foreign-born Latina mothers with college degree, so yeah, we can look at some college. But that was one thing that we were thinking that might also explain the mental health interaction that we're seeing, that very few foreign-born Latina mothers are reporting depressive symptoms severe enough to be categorized as depressed. And then few are also breaking up. So when you look at the intersection of those two groups, maybe it's just such a small number that it's kind of explaining an effect that we can't totally wrap our minds around.
Do you have any information on how recently they came? I mean, I just keep on wrapping my, when I look at kind of folks who come recently from Guatemala, the concept of divorce, you don't have a job, you don't speak English, you're not gonna leave, you have no place to go.
Right.
I'm just exaggerating, it's a stereotype, but it's like, it makes a lot of sense to me that you wouldn't be, that having more education, being here longer, it's an enculturation, but it's also, you have the resources to be able to get out.
Right.
Anyway, it's.
I can look at that. Do you remember if the Fragile Families has that? How long they've been in the U.S.? Do you remember if the Fragile Families has how long the parents have been in the U.S.? I can look at that, but that's a good suggestion.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you again, everyone, including our speakers, and we look forward to continuing conversations. Thanks.